Hello, this is a video for your Lab 6, kind of going into some of the APR structures to supplement the other video that we have in this folder. So once again, looking at these required terms and concepts for Lab 6, these are the main structures that you're going to need to know. I won't really get too much into the respiratory volumes and capacities, really just looking at these structures of the respiratory system. So hopefully the video kind of takes you through, it looks at a lot of the practice images as well as helps you to go through organizing the different regions of the respiratory system. So we're really just going to look at APR here. So I'm in my respiratory module. I can start in the nasal cavity. You know what? I actually am going to jump to the upper respiratory because I like this lateral view better than the coronal frontal view. Looking straight here, let's start with our nasal cavity itself, just being able to define this space of the nasal cavity. You can see you have the nose that reaches out here. Here is the hard palate that divides the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. This large structure is our tongue. You can see the teeth and the lips. So always take a moment just to orient yourself with the image. So that way you know what you're kind of looking at generally. So this large blue highlighted space is your nasal cavity. Air will travel in through here. It goes down the pharynx into our trachea to reach the lung. So you'll notice that in the nasal cavity there are these ridges of bone. These are called the nasal concha, and so there are three of them. Let's see if it'll let us highlight all three. We can start down at the bottom. We have the inferior nasal concha, the middle nasal concha, and then the superior nasal concha. So these are ridges of bone, and air is going to flow in between these ridges in these passageways, and it's going to help to slow it down. Because if we look at these from the front, they are actually spiraled, and so air tends to slow down. So it's a way for humidifying that air. Let's pull this off the side so I can see the structures as we're going through them. The tube that transports air in the nasal cavity as well as food, kind of once we get to the oral cavity, is the pharynx. So that's the name of the full tube, is the pharynx, and it's divided into its three regions. We have superiorly the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and then the laryngopharynx that is just behind this larynx structure. Okay, so that is the pharynx. Again, it's a common structure for air and food. At this lowest part, the laryngopharynx region, this is where the tube itself is going to divide either anteriorly down into the trachea or posterior into the esophagus. So food is going to go into the esophagus. Sometimes food will go what we call down the wrong pipe, and it will go forward into the trachea where only air is supposed to be, and that's when you start to cough and experience that sensation. With our larynx, let's look at that specifically. This is your larynx. You'll commonly call it the voice box, but it is the larynx is the anatomical name for it. Has some major features. We're going to look at one pulled out, but just to kind of see here in the body. This is the epiglottis. So it sits just underneath the tongue and it covers the larynx. And so when we swallow, if you're swallowing and eating food, food should move through the oropharynx. The epiglottis should close the larynx, so that way food goes down the esophagus. It moves posterior to the esophagus. If we're laughing, if we're talking, the epiglottis will be moving up and down, and so food can sometimes go into the larynx instead, and we have to cough it back up. Infants, toddlers, their swallowing center in the medulla oblongata isn't as developed, and so their epiglottis doesn't quite close as it should. And so it's very common for infants to spit up as they're trying to regulate breathing and eating at the same time. It's one of those where I tell you, don't try to think about it while you're doing it, because once you start to think about what's actually happening when you're breathing and swallowing and chewing, you'll start choking yourself. Let your body do its thing. Okay, so let's look at the larynx specifically here before I do that. So the file does have some other structures. It has like your tonsils. We looked at those when we were doing the immune system, so you should be familiar with those structures by this point. The sinuses, I'll pull up another picture for the sinuses in just a moment, but I wanted to move into the larynx and look at some of these specific laryngeal structures. So we have a larynx model. We have multiple views for it. So we're just going to start with the anterior view. Here is the larynx dissected out of the body. You can see this large superior prominence. That's the epiglottis. That's a piece of cartilage that we saw is going to close over the tube, the opening. You also have this bone that sits right here. This is your hyoid bone that sits in your throat. just above the larynx. It attaches to our tongue for swallowing and speech. It helps with those kind of things, but it doesn't attach to any other bone in our body. The rest of the larynx is made up mostly of just pieces of cartilage. There are some smaller muscles in there, but for the most part, the larynx is just cartilage. So some of the big things that we have is this big piece of cartilage right here called the thyroid cartilage. So the thyroid cartilage also has the laryngeal prominence. We'll commonly call this the Adam's apple. With males, genetic males, they have more testosterone, and so it tends to be thicker and more prominent. But it is also present in females as well. You can palpate it. If you kind of take your index finger, you can feel a little projection right there, and that is the laryngeal prominence. That is part of the thyroid cartilage. Okay? So what's important to remember is that the thyroid sits on your throat. It'll sit just kind of just inferior to this piece of cartilage right here. And so that's where this piece of cartilage gets its name, is because it's associated with the location of your thyroid in your throat versus your thymus that sits on your heart. Thyroid has an R, so it's in the throat. That's always how I remember it. So thyroid cartilage, laryngeal prominence, right, and epiglottis are three big features that we need to look at. The trachea is the actual windpipe. So the trachea and the larynx are two separate structures, but they are associated with each other just because of their connections. So we have the larynx, which is the most kind of prominent feature we're seeing here, that connects to the trachea, which is just an open tube that you also hear called your windpipe. If you have a dog, if you go to a pet store, you can see beef trachea. They're very common, and they're very characteristic because they have these rings of cartilage that we call the tracheal cartilage. Okay, so each one of these blue structures is a ring called a tracheal cartilage, and they have a little bit of other material, connective tissue, holding them together right here. So this helps to make sure it stays open and it does not close. It's not like the esophagus, which can constrict and dilate, or the bronchioles, which can constrict and dilate. The trachea is always open, always patent. Now, there is a piece of cartilage that connects the larynx to the trachea, and it's this piece right here called the cricoid cartilage. So the cricoid cartilage is the most inferior region, portion, structure, whatever you want to say, of the larynx, superior to the trachea. So that's most of what we can see from the front. Let's turn to the side a little bit and look at some of these structures. Again, some of them will be kind of reiterating. You have your epiglottis that will cover this opening. This opening is called the laryngeal inlet. So that opening of the larynx is the laryngeal inlet, and so that's what the epiglottis is closing over. And we can see things like our thyroid cartilage, our tracheal cartilage, and our cricoid cartilage. And so those three main pieces we saw before. There's the laryngeal prominence. Again. And then we can start to look at some of the actual structures that are involved with sound production. So the vestibular fold and the vocal fold. So the vocal fold, this is your vocal cord. There are two of them. These would be paired together. Your vocal cords are avascular and they vibrate. So right now I'm allowing air to pass over my vocal folds, and it's producing sound. If I want to make I can adjust the tautness of these cords. So if I bring the pitch of my voice up or I drop it down low, I'm adjusting the tautness of these vocal folds, and that's changing the actual production of sound. It's just superior to the vocal fold is the vestibular fold. So the vestibular fold is a vascular structure that is mostly providing protection and nourishment for these vocal fold layers. So the vestibular fold is this superior, slightly larger area. Vocal fold is actual sound production, this more inferior structure that we're seeing here. I'm looking at the required terms to see if there's anything else that I want to look at. I'll note your lab manual for the vocal cords. It has them listed as the true vocal cords and the false vocal cords. I typically stick with vocal fold and vestibular fold. If you put true or false, the quiz or practical will probably mark it incorrect, and I'll just go in and adjust that for you. Right, one last little piece that we want to look at, one more piece of cartilage or paired cartilages. It's called the arytenoid cartilage. You really can't see it laterally. It's most best viewed posterior, but it's these two pieces of cartilage right here. So once again, let's look at the other ones that we've seen. We can see our thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, and our tracheal cartilage. And now we're adding in the arytenoid cartilage, A-R-Y-T, arytenoid cartilage. Again, these two pieces of cartilage, a lot of these are used for attachments for ligaments and muscles to adjust the shape and sound of the larynx for voice production and vocal sound and vocal production. Those are the big things that we're looking at for that. Okay. What I want to move into next is our lower respiratory tract. All right, so once again, we can see things like the trachea in the lower respiratory tract. So the larynx would be just up here, more into the throat. As we move into the thoracic cavity, we have our trachea. Again, the trachea is a windpipe. It stays open constantly so that air can move in and out of here. The trachea is going to divide into our two bronchioles. It starts to get into our bronchial system. So the bronchioles themselves will then further keep dividing as they move into the lungs. So just going to highlight some of those structures real quick. We can see the trachea. I can click on a large bronchus. They divide and they divide again until they eventually get into the lungs. So when we're looking, going back to the trachea, I just want to jump through that real quick. The trachea itself is, before it splits, it has this little structure called a carina. It's this little internal projection right here. And this is actually an irritant receptor. So when you inhale, if there's any dust or smoke or dirt or anything in there, when you start coughing, that cough reflex is a lower respiratory reflex. And it's initiated when particles bind to that carina receptor, and it causes you to cough, hopefully before anything enters your lungs. It could be food, it could be, like I said, dust, smoke, any of that stuff. If you are a chronic smoker or exposed to a lot of irritants, this will start to get less sensitive over time and allow more things to go into your lungs. That's not something that we really want. And just scrolling down through those structures so I can keep following. So as I said before, the trachea is going to divide into your left main bronchus and your right main bronchus. Make sure that you are familiar with left and right, or you'll lose some credit on your answers. Quick, easy ways to tell is that the right bronchus is shorter and a little higher. The left one is longer, and the heart is pointing over to the left. Right? You can see how the lung kind of scrunches up there, and it actually has a structure that we're going to look at in a second. So starting with our bronchioles, though, you have your main bronchus. It's also called the primary. I tend to go with primary, secondary, tertiary is how I like to think about the bronchioles. But if that's not what's listed on here on APR, and so I know a lot of people tend to use the APR names, and that's okay. So you start with your main bronchus, left and right, and then it divides into a lobar or secondary bronchus. Right, so that's that second division. So you have one split from the trachea. That second split is going to be your secondary. And then you get into the segmental or the tertiary branches. So that's that third split. And these are going to keep going. These divide about, I think it's 12 to 16 more times, depending on which lung it is. And so each one of these is going to continue to divide and divide until they become microscopic. And they actually turn from just conducting structures to respiratory structures, which you'll get into a lecture, and that other lab video we'll discuss that some more. But these bronchioles, these tubes, as they divide, they get more and more smooth muscle, a higher concentration of smooth muscle to connective tissue or to cartilage. Same thing, similar. And that smooth muscle allows for bronchoconstriction and dilation, so you can actually start to regulate airflow. The trachea, the main bronchi, they don't have a ton of smooth muscle, so they tend to stay open. But for someone who has asthma, these bronchioles will start to constrict and restrict airflow into the lungs. So let's look at the lungs themselves. So we have our left lung and our right lung. The right lung actually has three lobes to it. You have the superior, middle, and inferior lobes. It's a little bit larger because it doesn't have the heart pushing into it. The left lung is a little bit smaller, so the left lung only has a superior and inferior lobe. And the left lung also has this structure called the cardiac notch, which is this little indentation that allows room for the heart to expand. And I've actually seen, and so the heart, again, kind of points over to the left. And what can happen for people that have congestive heart failure, if their heart starts to get really large and starts to expand, the lung will actually get pushed up. So this inferior lobe of the left lung can get pushed up into the thoracic cavity to allow room for the heart to continue expanding. It's very not good. We don't want that to happen. So each lung, left and right, is divided into those different lobes, and those lobes are further divided into smaller segments that you'll listen to and look at lecture. I always like to share my dad. He has had lung cancer twice. Yes, twice. And the first time they actually had to take out a small section of his right lung. So they didn't take out a whole lobe. Each lung is divided into, again, about 12 to 15 sections. Each section is going to be fed by its own little microscopic bronchiole. And that little bronchopulmonary section, they can just dissect out one piece, and the rest of the lung, the rest of that lobe can still be functional. It's a protective mechanism of the lung to isolate pathogens or infections, because inhaling things is a very common way of us getting sick. And so by being able to isolate, not just through a lobe, but into a smaller segment, that allows for the lungs to stay protected. And so, yeah, my dad, he had to have a small segment of one of his lungs removed, and still doing fine. With the lungs, these lobes are divided by these fissures. You can see kind of these dividing lines that are formed here. And so these are the different fissures of the lungs. We have the horizontal fissure that is only going to be in the right lung. And then you have the oblique fissure. See, the oblique fissure is going to divide on the right side, it divides your inferior from your middle. On the left side, because there's just the two lobes, it divides superior, inferior. So oblique fissures on both, horizontal fissure only in the right lung. Since we're looking at this outer structure of the lung, let's talk about the different membranes that cover the lungs, because each lung itself, you can kind of see this little thin structure that's kind of wrapping on top of it. These are your serous membranes that cover the lungs. So quick refresh, mucous membranes are exposed to the outside of the environment, your mouth, your nose, urogenital tracts, reproductive, and your rectum, your digestive tract. Those are all mucous membranes exposed to the outside environment. When we're talking about a membrane that's enclosed, your thoracic cavity, your abdominal cavity, these are serous membranes. So serous membranes are fully enclosed inside of the body, and they have a double layer that helps to seal organs into the thoracic cavity. So in the lungs, we call it the pleura. So you can see this word down here, Pleura. Anytime you see pleura, it's referring to the lungs. Pleuritis, anything like that, it's referring to the lungs. Visceral is telling you which layer of that serous membrane it is. So a serous membrane always has two layers. Visceral attaches directly to the organ. Visceral refers to organs. So the visceral pleura is the membrane attached to the lungs. That's what those words, how you can translate those words. Visceral pleura, membrane attached to the lungs. The parietal pleura, even though it looks like it's kind of on top of here, it's actually going to be attached to the thoracic cavity. So it's going to be attached kind of to the wall on the inside of the rib cage. And so that is the parietal pleura. Parietal is the word that refers to the wall of the cavity. Pleura is telling you which cavity it is. Okay, so parietal pleura, it's this one that you can see here. It is on top of the diaphragm, covering the lungs, right? This is attaching them to the outside this is attaching them to the thoracic wall, so that way they helps to stay open. And the visceral pleura is attached directly to the lungs. And then in between these two membranes, that's that pleural cavity, where there's some serous fluid to help with lubrication. Let's see. Some other just general features of the lungs. I'm not sure if we'll be able to see everything in here. I'll probably move to one of the practice images. But things like the apex and the base. So with the lungs, the apex is going to be up here at the top. The pointy part is usually the part that we call apex. So the apex would be the superior portion. The base is down here where it's attaching to the diaphragm. It's this larger, flatter region. And so that's the base of the lung is down there. And then I think that's most of the structures that we need for that. Let's look at this practice atlas. A few different images here so we can see the diaphragm, this muscle that attaches to the bottom of the lungs, the base of the lungs, and is our primary respiratory muscle. So when you inhale, the diaphragm flattens, it pulls down on the lungs and it causes them to expand so air can rush in. And then when you relax your diaphragm, it contracts and it pushes air back up and out. I can look at that. We want to look at any more of these images. I think I just froze up my screen.